Could you imagine if I leave meeting by accident?
Hold on. Think again. Don't you know we're just starting? Oops.
Yeah, I'm like, you hated this one, so it's not. Well, it looks like it is on. Unless I'm wrong. Wow. Oh, that one. Oh. Okay. But let me turn off. It's weird, I can hear myself now. Alright. Shut up. Thank you. Sorry, I'm talking to the music, not the people. Hello. Alright. Hello, everyone. Welcome to... What? Oh, right. Well, yeah, there we go.
Alright, everyone, yeah, we're good.
Okay, everyone can see, everyone can hear. Everyone has all their sensory organs intact. I'm very sorry to hear that. Anyway, welcome to my combat design talk, or just a basic way to go toe-to-toe using some basic tips and tricks. Check in if anyone needs to check in.
Yes, everyone has to check in.
If anyone is still not checked in, please check in.
To do so, and also if you haven't signed up. We usually have a QR code, we ran out of them.
Yes, usually there's a QR code. No more.
There's one more if you go to the next one. That's fucking stupid. Here, I can send it in Discord.
Shannon's sending it over Discord.
Yep. It'll be in the announcements channel.
Alright. Mega people, make sure to check in. Shannon's sending it into the announcements channel. Moving on to the next slide.
Yeah, so if you also do want to give a talk for Mega, we have a forum. This will also be linked in Discord as well. Well, we'll probably do this later today or tomorrow. But if you want to give a talk about anything from Mega, like any topic at all, you can even, there's many forums we can do. We can do workshops, presentations, Q&As, or a roundtable. And please let us know. We're interested in many aspects of game development and want students to talk about them if they are interested. So that's it for me today.
All right, rock and roll. Let's get started. So first, who am I? Some of you know me already, but if you don't, my name's Amari. I'm a third year at IMGD. I'm a combat and movement designer for Bugnauts. I'm a maker of things. I like to make stuff. I make a lot of different stuff. I'm in the middle of my own little side project of making a little tabletop role-playing game. And I've got brainworms. So let's get started. These are some of my favorite games. I have a lot of different games that I would call my favorite on my list of like top 10 favorite games all time. But as far as combat is concerned, these are some of my faves. And yeah, so without further ado, let's talk about combat. What the hell is combat design? I like to refer to it as the rhythmic art of beating the crap out of your enemies. It's very fun to have like that kind of push and pull between attack and defense and trying to bob and weave. It's almost like a dance in a way, which I find very interesting to think about. It's very fun. It's very exhilarating. It's also crazy hard. What I'm going to go over today is a lot of different fundamental tips and tricks, but what I want you to take away from this is not necessarily that everything that I'm about to talk about is applicable to every game, but to hopefully inspire you to like diagnose specifically what your game needs and to apply most of what I'm talking about today into your own experience. So, in keeping with that, I like to use what I refer to as a feelings-first design approach. I know a lot of designers, especially very novice designers, will start ideating different mechanics or level design ideas before really knowing what their game is going to be. To me, that's putting the cart before the horse. What I prefer to do is to figure out the way I want my game to feel like to play. So that's kind of finding out what your like core identity for your experience is and then finding out what the best way to express that idea is through mechanics, and for today's discussion, through combat. And so that begs the question, how in the world do you do that? And so, like I mentioned, you have to find out what your game needs. There's a quote I like to think about from Red Dead Redemption 2 that's, we'll save fellas as need saving, and we'll shoot fellas as need shooting, and we'll find out what you need. One of the, you hear this all the time, especially if you're a member of the games program, but you have to be open to change. A lot of stuff is going to, by the time your game is done with development, is going to be most likely quite different from when it started from a design perspective. And you have to be open to that change. Even in my own experience on Bugnots, there are a lot of mechanics that I personally ideated, prototyped, developed that we've had to cut. And you've got to be able to A, not take that personally, but B, be open to the version of the game that you made, not the version of the game that you thought really hard about and made prototypes for. Stick to that core vision of what you want your game to be, and let all the more superficial elements of what exact attacks and dodges and what have you, let all of that just kind of be open to being changed, essentially. So, in keeping with what your game needs, the needs of a game like Minecraft will be very different from the combat needs of something like Bayonetta. Um, if for the two people in the audience who don't know what Minecraft is, it's in the name. It's about mining and crafting. You don't need a lot of different combat stuff for that. There's swords, there's bows, and other than like a couple other things, that's pretty much it. But with Bayonetta, there's a bunch of different combos. There's a bunch of different unique combat elements that you have to keep track of, and a lot of visual information you'll need to keep an eye on in each fight. So you just really got to know what your game is to make good combat for it. So we'll start with offense, our attacks, the greatest defense. One of the first things you'll notice whenever you attack in any video game is the speed. The fast attacks obviously are it's very easy to use these to quickly overwhelm your opponent, which is always good. That's what I gravitate towards when I play games. But they can also be very quickly overtuned from a design perspective, especially in a PvP environment where it's testing the skill of two players versus, who are fighting one another. You'll want to be very diligent and careful and observant about the way you employ very fast-moving, hard-hitting attacks. It can be easily balanced if they also provide some utility like movement, especially if they're on something like a cooldown. And then the player has to invest a little bit more than 1 microsecond to attack. But you've just got to be aware of a number of other factors if you're going to use fast attacks. Slow attacks are also very fun because they deal a lot more damage generally. But these also open the player up to getting attacked more. So a little bit later, I'll talk about things like startup and end lag and how that kind of opens up the player to being hit more often. You can also use this to your advantage for enemy design. If you want your enemies to be able to get hit more often, you can make their attacks a little bit more slow. You can give them a little bit more telegraphing, and then they'll be open to getting hit at the beginning, at the end, whatever you want. But yeah, moving on. Next is utility. This is one of my favorite aspects of the different attacks in a lot of different games, is that they're effectively viewing attacks as a trying to think of the word for it. The idea is that you want to ideate different forms of attack in the same way that you would ideate different tools in a toolkit or different weapons in your arsenal. Each attack should have something new it brings to the table. Maybe one attack is faster. Maybe one attack has a longer range. Maybe one attack goes into another mechanic. Say, like in a fighting game, one attack might build more meter than another attack. So you want to provide a unique wealth of options for your players, especially if that's making up for the weaknesses of other attacks. So in something like Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door, you have two basic attacks when you start out as Mario. You have your stomp and you have your hammer. And neither of these is applicable to every single scenario. Now, of course, later in the game, you get badges, you get new hammers, new shoes, what have you. But the basic premise is that there will be enemies that have spikes, so you can't stomp them. There will be enemies that are just have more defense, so you can't hit them with a hammer. You have to making it so that there's not one universal attack that always connects. Um, makes keeping that kind of attack out of the game opens it up to a lot more variance. Is essentially what I'm trying to say. So, moving on, we also have spacing, which is a very important thing as well. This adds to what a lot of fighting game players will call safety in your move toolkits. If a move is referred to as safe, that means generally the person using that move does not get hit when they're using it. So if I'm, say, Byleth in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, I can use my Lance, the side B or whatever, to hit my opponent, and then if they're like playing Little Mac, they're gonna get hit by it. Like if I've given myself enough room between myself and my enemy, and I hit him with the tip of that spear, there's not much you can really do about it. So if that's what you want, that's great. If not, be aware of it. And speaking of spacing on the stage, you'll want to make sure that your players feel like they're in control of how much space they have. So, like, say if you're playing a shooter or you're playing as a character who has a lot of ranged attacks, you'll want to A, get cover, and then B, get far enough away from your enemy that you can use your moves without getting hit in the face with their fist. So a lot of games will do that. You like just with the nature of the level that enemies will be on one end of the hallway and you'll be on the other end. Some games more like in your face action games like the Batman Arkham series, or even the Spider-Man games will have like a little bit of magnetism on the player whenever they're inputting an attack. So Batman or Spider-Man will kind of gently glide towards the enemy as they devastate them with an uppercut. And or they could even be skill based. Your spacing, your motivations for spacing. If you're very familiar with Super Smash Brothers, you might be familiar with the fact that the very tip of Marth's falchion does more damage than the rest of his sword. So you want to stay not to maximize your damage, you don't want to stay immediately next to your opponent, but just far enough away for your aerials to hit. So you just want to make sure that your arenas, the place where the fights take place, are built with your main character's unique tools in mind. So this is my example I used before. Almost, we have Min Min, who has, I think, bar none, some of the furthest hitting attacks in the game that aren't literally projectiles. And then there's Little Mac, who generally has a lot of moves that will not hit unless you're directly next to Little Mac. So that's the kind of stuff you want to be aware of whenever you're designing your game. And then I think lastly, we have input. This is generally not something that's going to be super important for every video game, but something you always want to consider, especially if your game is supposed to be a little bit more difficult, is how complex do you want the input to be? So for something like a fighting game, there's a lot of complex motion inputs that help gate off higher value moves from lower skill players. So even something as simple as like using your super in Guilty Gear Strive, you have to do a way more complex input than doing any of your normals and most of your specials. So if you want your players to like feel skillful just for having done the move, that's a good way to do it. It's also a great way to like kind of bottleneck lower skill players from abusing high value moves. So if anyone's familiar with Overwatch, there's a character named Widowmaker who has a sniper rifle. And that sniper rifle does devastating damage in that game. I think, if I were to estimate, around 2/3 of the cast will die if they are shot in the head by that sniper rifle. And the ones who don't die immediately are left with like a paper thin amount of health. So the Blizzard's path, their methodology for balancing that is just you just have to be good at the game already to kind of be able to abuse that mechanic a lot, which does make for some frustrating gameplay. But that's Blizzard's poison of choice, so I'll let them deal with that. But yeah, that's there's that, and it's also you also have to be careful, and the reason why a lot of games don't do this is because it also raises your difficulty floor by a lot. If you make a lot of your different attacks only available through very specific inputs or by memorizing a whole list of combos, you're going to cut off your game from a large majority of your demographic that will just be lower skilled and they just won't have the time, dedication, or intrinsic drive to learn all the different ways to like beat down on these guys, and they'll just play something else. So you just got to really be careful when you're messing with that. But anyway, let's get into some defensive options that you can use. There's obviously the classic blocking. Um, Got to avoid damage somehow. Shields are great for that, especially if you've got a more methodical system like the original Dark Soul games, which are a little bit more strategic. A lot of RPGs that are also lean more heavily into strategy than quick reaction time. Also have a lot of different defensive moves that are basically akin to like putting up a shield. And something like a fighting game that'll be weak to grabs, but these blocks and the other two defensive options that I'm going to talk about here are huge candidates for some of the most unique mechanics in the entire combat system. So right here, I've got this GIF of Bayonetta using Witch Time. This is technically a clip from Smash, but it works the same way in her home series too. That if she dodges at just the right time, she'll slow down her opponent, and they'll be open to a litany of counterattack. So if you pay attention, there's a lot of games that have these kinds of mechanics where the player gets a huge advantage out of optimizing their defense. So that brings us into parrying. This is a clip from one of my faves, Sekiro, where like you see Genichiro hits this huge attack, the player parries it, and then hits what's called the Mikiri counter, where they just kind of step on Genichiro's sword when he tries to stab the player. So this is really great for really fast, frenetic, and skillful fighting systems. Sekiro is a game that is very challenging, but it does reward a very skillful use of the mechanics. And so combining that with some extra juice and some game feel punch up, this can be a very rewarding way of having your player avoid damage. And that brings us finally into dodging. It's easily the simplest way to avoid damage. It's also great for more quick, frenetic, and chaotic fighting systems. And it's very simple. It's very intuitive. You don't have to spend a lot of time tutorializing it. Just don't get hit. If you don't want to take damage, don't get hit. And it also doubles as a phenomenal movement tool for games that also have platformer elements. So right here I've got Hades, this little gif of Hades, or the game Hades, that's Zagreus, but there are a lot of boons from the game that you get from different Olympic gods, and so if you get a certain list of power-ups off of Hermes, it can let you really abuse that dodge to like move around the stage in the blink of an eye. And so that's just something else that you're going to want to keep track of. And so moving into enemies, these guys should be as, if not more, varied, unique, and interesting as the different attacks in your game. Because every enemy, the worst thing that could happen is that you have enemies that are like very easy to beat. They're very, you just have to, or this is one of my criticisms of Ocarina of Time, actually, that where a lot of the enemies, you just have to wait to fight them. They'll either be attacking or be in a state where you can't attack them, and then you have to wait for them to be vulnerable and then attack them then. I personally find that kind of boring. There's a way you can make that kind of interesting. Combat design, like game design, has like a lot of no wrong answers, only wrong executions. But yeah, a lot of games with great combat systems will have a lot of unique ways for the player to engage with defeating specific enemies. A lot of games will try to go for that by having enemies that are only vulnerable to one type of attack. I find that a little bit boring because now uh, in combat, players like to try to express themselves as a great form of player expression, and then bottlenecking that and limiting it to only one or two different approaches to defeating an enemy kind of defeats that whole purpose and kind of makes it a little uh, makes it suck a little bit. So what I would propose instead is just giving them a resistance to something. And then it's like, okay, let me not do that. Let me go use the rest of my arsenal instead of, oh, let me go get this one attack. Let me go get this one weapon, this one power up to go make fighting this guy less of a slogfest. And so you can also combine this with your what we talked about previously with finding out what your game needs and what your game's kind of core vision is. And so to prevent what the academics refer to as ludonarrative dissonance, you'll want to make sure these enemies are uh, engaging the player in a way that forces them to fight in the way that you, the designer, want them to fight. So if you have a character who only uses like martial arts hand to hand combat, don't put them up against a lot of ranged enemies unless you really know what you're doing. If there's a lot of extra context around that, of like power ups or something about the level that helps kind of balance that out. Otherwise, your player's going to have a bad time. And if that's not your intention, you're going to want to avoid that. And so with enemies, there's a couple of different ways you can make them easier to fight if you are going for a lower skill demographic or combat's not a real emphasize part of your game. You can telegraph, you can have them telegraph their attacks. So that's if they're using this big sword move that does a lot of damage, you're going to want them to like really swing back almost like if you've ever seen like a baseball batter just like have them really swing back so then the player sees it and they know, oh, this attack's coming, let me go ahead and not be in front of them when they're attacking. um, and so you can have that. You can have them do. I'm a big fan of Sekiro's like little stand and wait thing they have enemies do, where if you're defeating an enemy and you get a death blow, that's a long animation, and having the player get hit during that would suck. So what they have the enemies do is nothing. When you when you death blow an enemy in Sekiro, everyone else watches their comrade die, and then you can get back into fighting and killing the rest of them. Um, I think it's pretty good. It's pretty subtle. I didn't really notice it until a good way through the game. And it's a great way to keep this really cool moment of you hitting this like Kurosawa style death blow on this guy, a really fun and engaging moment. And then other games like I think Batman Arkham and Spider-Man both do this, where if you're fighting like these hordes of enemies, there will be moments where there are enemies that are behind the camera and the player just can't see. And so what they'll have the enemies do when they're not on camera is nothing. They won't attack Spider-Man until there are either less enemies on screen or if the camera turns to see them. Um, and another way you can make them easier, of course, is to like do something called stun locking, where if you like attack an enemy during a certain part of their attack, they'll either slow down or stop entirely. It'll completely take them out of the animation, and then that opens them up to you being able to attack them. So that's a little bit more in the vein of parrying, where it's like, oh, I've got to risk something. I've got to risk fucking this up and getting hurt to hurt them. So that can be interesting in its own way. And then if you want to make them harder, there's something very mean you can do where you can use some like basic AI to like have them learn what the player does. If a player will always dodge over someone's head, have the enemy learn to like grab them or put up their shield or what have you, force them to use one of their many other forms of attack to come at them. Or you can make use. I'm a big fan of exploiting the weaknesses of the player's own arsenal. So the Mega Man games do this. I think, if I remember correctly, the Castlevania games also do this, where it's very hard to attack vertically. There's not a lot of verticality to Mega Man's different forms of attack without using one of the other special weapons he gets from defeating the bosses in the game. And those are tied to a meter. So once you run out of ammunition for that, it's over. So if the player wants to conserve that for the end of the stage when they're fighting the boss, then that leaves them with only their regular Mega Buster that doesn't take ammunition. But that only goes horizontally. So there are a lot of enemies in the game that will attack Mega Man either diagonally or they'll attack him like directly vertically. And so that's where the challenge of Mega Man comes from largely is that there's a lot of enemies that you can't get to without also having really tight platforming challenges to like move up the stairs and like hit them in the way that makes them die. Um, so yeah, and now we're gonna move on to game feel. This is like the most important part for like getting your besides obviously the mechanics, but like to make sure you follow through on that core vision of making the game feel the way you want it to feel and having it for lack of a better term, giving it the punch that you want it to have. Um, so, what is juice? If you don't already know, juice is a game designer term that just refers to a bunch of the extra stuff that just makes the game feel good to play. These are your sound effects. These are your slow mos, particles, something called hit stop, which we'll talk about in a second. These are everything you want to add in that will really. It's a lot of really subtle things that, when put together, will make the player feel the way you want them to feel. So this is Ken. Everyone say hi, Ken.
I can.
Um,
This is Joe.
so true. Okay, so this is Ken from I think this is specifically from Capcom versus SNK, but he has this attack, this really heavy roundhouse kick that he does, and you'll see animators will be familiar with this concept of easing the character into their animation. So you see when the animation starts, Ken is kind of twisting his body. He's getting ready to like unleash this kick. And then in one frame, he like moves from like having his foot below him to having his foot above him, which kind of emphasizes the like speed at which he's moving. And then we move into what they call the active frames. He moves out of the startup where the move is starting up, and then he moves into the active frames where if the enemy is making contact with Ken's foot, they're gonna get hit. They're just gonna get hit. It's gonna make contact. And then at the end, at the very end of the animation, where Ken's kind of recovering, following through from the motion, that's what we call recovery frames. And so, you see he's putting his foot back on the ground, he's recentering his balance, all of this stuff. So, what you want to be aware of as a combat designer, you'll want to work with your animation team to make sure that the startup before the attack is active and that the recovery after the attack ends are forgiving enough for your player to not immediately get struck. Or if it's a PvP game, if it's like a fighting game like this game comes from, you're going to want to make sure that heavier, hard hitting attacks like this roundhouse kick have a shorter active time. Um, if you want your character, if you want your attack to be faster, to end faster, for in exchange for doing less damage, you'll like cut off some of that startup, some of that recovery. Um, it's just something you want to be aware of as a tool in your kit to like as an easy way to tune damage without completely scrapping a bunch of work you've already done and making something new that more fits your design goals. There are other kinds of effects. If you really want to like a real masterclass in juice from a fighting game, from a platform fighter especially, you can go to Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. I've got this GIF here of Little Mac hitting this huge KO punch on this other Little Mac. You see the zoom in, the background changes. There's this whole like little flare around the point of contact, and there's this little after image after the attack lands. It's a very beautiful attack. There's also this little GIF here I have of God of War. I think this is God of War 2018, where he like hits this one move. There's this slow mo that really lets you see the weapon right before it makes contact, and then Kratos and his son jump up on this guy, and you can just tell it's over for him. So combining all this stuff is something you're really gonna want to pay attention to. As you're like, this is something you're gonna really get into, like really during the later stages of development, but it's something you want to think about as you ideate different attacks. Anyway, so I'm doing like a little. Here's a little comparison between Super Smash Brothers, which I already complimented heavily on its attention to juice, and here's Nickelodeon All Stars Brawl, which you may have remembered came out, I think last year or the year before. Either way, um, and you can just really see the difference between the more refined juice of like this hit stop that occurs on Ganon's sword. You can see it like kind of stops a little bit at the point of contact, and so you can really see that this guy just got hit hard. But then there's this like whatever this attack is that Rocco from Rocco's Modern Life is doing on Hugh Neutron, where it feels a little bit more floaty. It's like it's an attack in the same way, but it doesn't feel the same. Hopefully, this points out a little bit of like the subtle difference in feeling that it has. And of course, if you really want to see, you can play both these games. You can play other games that have like a similar disparity between their levels of juice. It's why it's very important to play games that are not good as well as it is to play games that are good, to learn from mistakes as well as learn from success. But yeah, that's pretty much it for me. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you especially to people who took time of their Friday evening to be here presently, physically in this theater. Big shout out to you guys. But yeah, if it's all right, I think I can take questions. If people have questions at all about anything I said, let me see what this says. Nope. Okay. Oh, yo, what's up? It's its own like I could do like a lot of different talks about a lot of different specific realms of combat design. There's a lot of different ways it can go, but for Bugnot specifically, the way we kind of handled it, especially because our game is made for a much younger and lower skill range audience, we have a lot of the enemies still be close up, kind of. There's a lot of kind of almost like a boxing ring where the enemies will be and they're shooting their little projectiles. We've slowed down the projectiles so they're easier to catch and throw back. And there's not that many enemies at one time because even though we're using these bullet hell elements that will fill the screen with which will traditionally fill the screen with a lot of different patterns of bullets and a lot of dangers and all this stuff. We wanted to like kind of take the bite out of that a little bit for the kids to still make it like challenging. Like you still have to like uh, um, perform skillfully to like beat the game, but it's not overwhelming. So we wanted to avoid having situations where there are like really long corridors where enemies are shooting at you and you have to like get past this like wall of damage to be able to defeat them. Because that's just more intense than we want for our target audience. But yeah, hopefully that answered your question. Anyone else? Anything else? Zoom chat have anything? Yo, what's up? Yeah, so we just the way we have it right now is that like a lot of different enemies will they just have they become more unique as the game goes on essentially. So we when you start in the tutorial and in the first area there are ants that only have like a couple simple patterns. They primarily shoot out only one very basic kind of bullet. And that just helps the player like get acclimated, helps the tutorialization process, and then excuse me, as you get further towards the game, you have like beetles that deal like physical kinds of damage, which you obviously can't catch in your bug net, so that presents its own kind of challenge. And then you get into bees, which are now a flying enemy, but now they also deal this kind of venomous acidic damage that now makes you think about where you're standing as well as trying to aim upward now, which makes it a little bit more challenging as you go on. And then, of course, the final boss will be this kind of spider that combines all of these things together into one, hopefully summative combat experience. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question. I hope. But yeah, unless anyone else has anything they'd like to say, questions, comments, anything, I think that'll be me wrapped up.
Yeah, that'll be it for today. Thank you everyone so much for attending. Mega will have more updates about future. I think we'll just have one more event because next week is Thanksgiving, so we're not gonna fucking be here. And then
Real.
the prediction line, and then the week after that, we'll probably do a game showcase or something if there's any interest in that. But really, that's it from us. So thank you all so much for attending, and we hope you had a good time. And thank you, Amari, for doing this.
Thank you so much, everyone.